The stars were silent as they always were. But tonight, their silence felt heavier, more ominous, like the calm before a storm that could shatter worlds. On the edge of the Orion Arm, where the light of distant suns barely reached, humanity had carved out a fragile existence. It was a place of serenity, a haven far from the chaos of the inner systems. But serenity, as it turns out, is a fragile thing, a fleeting illusion that can be torn apart in the blink of an eye. And tonight, that illusion was about to be shattered. It began with a signal. Not the kind of signal you'd expect from the depths of space. No cryptic alien message or distress call. This was different. It was a pulse, faint but deliberate, like the heartbeat of something ancient and vast. It came from the void, from a region of space that had been declared empty for centuries. At first, the scientists dismissed it as interference, a glitch in the sensors. But when the pulse repeated, stronger this time, it became impossible to ignore. Something was out there. And it was coming closer. On the surface of the colony world Elysium 7, life went on as usual. The settlers had built a paradise here, a world of rolling green hills and crystal-clear rivers. They had left behind the wars and politics of Earth, trading it for a simpler life under alien skies. But even in paradise there were whispers. Stories passed down from generation to generation, tales of a time when humanity had been forced to fight for its survival. Those stories were meant to be just that, stories. But as the pulse grew stronger, the settlers began to wonder if the past was about to repeat itself. In the heart of the colony, a young engineer worked tirelessly in her lab. She had always been drawn to the stars, to the mysteries they held. When the signal first appeared, she was the one who noticed the pattern, the rhythm that suggested intelligence. It wasn't random. It wasn't natural. It was a message, a warning, or perhaps a declaration of war. She didn't know yet, but she was determined to find out. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the equipment, her mind racing with possibilities. What if they weren't alone? What if the stories were true? Meanwhile, on the other side of the colony, a veteran soldier stood on a hill overlooking the settlement. He had seen too much in his lifetime, too many battles, too much loss. He had come to Elysium 7 to escape, to find peace. But as he stared at the horizon, he felt a familiar unease creeping into his bones. The air was too still, the night too quiet. It reminded him of the moments before an ambush, when the world seemed to hold its breath. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing: when it arrived, he would be ready. As the hours passed, the pulse grew stronger, more insistent. It was no longer just a signal, it was a presence, a force that seemed to press against the very fabric of reality. The settlers gathered in the town square, their faces pale with fear. They had built their lives here, their futures. But now those futures hung in the balance. The engineer stood before them, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She explained what little they knew, what little they could understand. Something was coming. Something powerful. Something that could change everything. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, it happened. The sky split open, a jagged tear of light that seemed to defy the laws of physics. From the tear emerged a ship, massive and dark, its surface etched with symbols that no human eye had ever seen. It hovered above the colony, silent and unmoving, like a predator sizing up its prey. The settlers stared in awe and terror, their hearts pounding in their chests. This was no exploration vessel, no diplomatic envoy. This was a warship. And it had come for them. The soldier clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the soul of humanity. Would they cower in fear, or would they rise to meet the challenge? The engineer stepped forward, her eyes locked on the ship. She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing: they couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. As the ship began to descend, the settlers braced themselves for what was to come. The pulse had been a warning, a harbinger of the storm that was about to engulf them. But humanity had faced storms before. They had endured, they had fought, and they had survived. This time would be no different. The stars might be silent, but humanity would not be. This was their world, their future. And they would defend it no matter the cost. But as the shadows of the alien ship fell over the colony, one question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. What happens when Serenity turns to war? The answer was coming, faster than anyone could have imagined. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The alien ship loomed over Elysium 7 like a storm cloud, its shadow swallowing the colony whole. The settlers stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in unison. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream to run. but there was nowhere to run. The ship was everywhere, its presence suffocating, its silence more terrifying than any sound. It didn't attack. It didn't speak. It just hovered, watching, waiting. And that was the worst part, the not knowing. The engineer, her hands still trembling, stepped forward. She was no soldier, but she had a mind sharper than most, and right now that mind was racing. She had spent her life studying the stars, decoding signals, and piecing together the mysteries of the universe. But this was beyond anything she had ever encountered. The symbols on the ship's surface glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the signal they had detected earlier. It was a language, she was sure of it. But what was it saying? Was it a warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? The soldier, his jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed, moved to stand beside her. He didn't say a word, but his presence was enough. He had seen war, real war, the kind that leaves scars on your soul. He knew what it looked like, what it smelled like, what it felt like. And this felt like the beginning of something far worse. He glanced at the engineer, his voice low and steady. We need to get these people to safety. Now. But safety was a relative term. The colony had no defenses, no weapons, no way to fight back. They had never needed them. Elysium 7 was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where humanity could start over, far from the conflicts of the past. But the past, it seemed, had a way of catching up. The soldier's mind raced as he scanned the horizon. There were caves in the mountains, deep and hidden. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He turned to the crowd, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Everyone listen to me. We need to move. Now, follow me and stay close. The settlers hesitated, their eyes darting between the soldier and the ship. Fear had rooted them to the spot, but fear could only hold them for so long. One by one they began to move, their footsteps hurried and unsteady. The engineer stayed behind, her eyes still locked on the ship. She couldn't look away. There was something about it, something that pulled at her like a puzzle begging to be solved. But this wasn't the time for puzzles. This was the time for survival. As the settlers made their way toward the mountains, the engineer finally turned to follow. But before she could take a step, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. It started as a faint vibration, barely noticeable, but it grew quickly, shaking the earth with a force that knocked her off her feet. She looked up, her heart in her throat, just as the ship began to descend. It wasn't landing, it was drilling, its massive hull piercing the ground like a knife through butter. The air filled with the sound of tearing metal and crumbling rock, a cacophony that drowned out everything else. The soldier grabbed the engineer by the arm, pulling her to her feet. We need to go. Now, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. She nodded, her legs shaky but determined. They ran, joining the stream of settlers as they fled toward the mountains. Behind them, the ship continued its descent, its hull glowing brighter with each passing second. Whatever it was doing, it wasn't good. As they reached the edge of the colony, the engineer glanced back one last time. The ship was almost fully submerged now, its surface barely visible above the ground. But something else caught her eye, a figure standing at the edge of the crater. It was humanoid but not human. Its body was tall and slender, its skin a shimmering silver that seemed to reflect the light in strange, unnatural ways. It turned its head, its eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, without a word, it raised its hand, and the ground beneath the colony erupted in a blinding flash of light. The explosion was deafening, a shockwave that knocked everyone off their feet. The engineer hit the ground hard, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. When she finally managed to sit up, her heart sank. The colony was gone. Where there had once been homes and fields, there was now only a smoking crater. The ship was gone too, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But the figure, the silver being, was still there, standing at the edge of the crater, watching. The soldier was the first to recover, his training kicking in even as his mind reeled from what he had just witnessed. He helped the engineer to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. We need to keep moving, he said, his voice grim. They're not done. Not yet. The settlers, shaken but alive, began to move again, their pace slower now, their spirits crushed. The engineer walked beside the soldier, her mind racing. Who were they? What did they want? And why had they destroyed the colony without a word? She had so many questions but no answers. Only one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. As they reached the safety of the caves, the engineer turned to the soldier, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't just hide. We need to fight back. We need to understand what we're up against. The soldier nodded, his expression grim. I know. But first we need to survive. And to do that, we need to know what we're dealing with. He glanced at the settlers, their faces pale and drawn. "We'll figure this out. Together." But as the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the land, the engineer couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The ship, the figure, the destruction, it all pointed to something bigger, something far more dangerous than they could imagine. And as she stared out at the horizon, she couldn't help but wonder, what happens when the battlefield comes to you? The answer she knew was coming. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The caves were cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and fear. The settlers huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with shock. The engineer sat near the entrance, her back against the rough stone wall, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the figure, the silver being that had stood at the edge of the crater, watching. There had been no anger in its eyes, no hatred. Just curiosity. And that scared her more than anything. The soldier moved among the settlers, his presence a quiet reassurance. He checked on each of them, offering a word of comfort here, a firm nod there. But his mind was elsewhere. He had seen war, but this was different. This wasn't a fight for territory or resources. This was something deeper, something darker. And he didn't like it one bit. As the night wore on, the engineer finally stood, her legs stiff from sitting too long. She approached the soldier, her voice low. "We can't just sit here. We need to know what we're up against. If we're going to survive, we need answers." The soldier nodded, his expression grim. "I know. But we can't just rush in blind. We need a plan." The engineer hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, a handheld scanner she had managed to grab before they fled the colony. "This might help. It's not much, but it can pick up energy signatures. If they're still out there, we might be able to track them." The soldier studied the device, then looked at her. "You're not thinking of going out there, are you?" She met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Do we have a choice?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. Staying in the caves was only delaying the inevitable. Whatever was out there, they couldn't hide from it forever. As the first light of dawn began to creep into the cave, the soldier and the engineer prepared to leave. The settlers watched in silence, their faces a mix of fear and hope. They didn't say anything, but their eyes said it all. "Be careful. Come back. Don't leave us." The engineer took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always been more comfortable in a lab than in the field, but this was no time for comfort. This was about survival. She glanced at the soldier, who gave her a curt nod. Together they stepped out into the open. The world outside was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground. The crater where the colony had once stood was still smoking, a grim reminder of what had happened. The engineer activated the scanner, her eyes scanning the readout. At first there was nothing. Then a faint blip. She adjusted the settings, her hands trembling slightly. The blip grew stronger, more defined. It was coming from the north, deep in the mountains. The soldier glanced at her. "What is it?" She shook her head. "I don't know. But it's big. And it's moving." They exchanged a look, then began to move toward the signal. The terrain was rough, the path steep and treacherous. But they pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, the cold biting at their skin. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Finally, they reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The engineer's scanner was going crazy now, the blip so strong it was almost overwhelming. She peered over the edge, her breath catching in her throat. Below them, nestled in the valley, was another ship. But this one was different. It was smaller, sleeker, its surface covered in the same strange symbols as the first. And it was active. The soldier crouched beside her, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell is that?" The engineer shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know. But it's not alone." As if on cue, a door on the side of the ship slid open and a figure stepped out. It was the same silver being they had seen before, its movements smooth and deliberate. It paused, its head tilting as if listening. Then it turned and looked directly at them. The engineer's heart skipped a beat. "It knows we're here." The soldier cursed under his breath. "We need to move. Now." But before they could react, the being raised its hand, and a beam of light shot out from the ship, hitting the ridge just feet from where they were hiding. The ground shook violently, sending rocks tumbling down the slope. The engineer lost her balance, sliding toward the edge. The soldier grabbed her arm, pulling her back just in time. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get back to the caves." The engineer nodded, her mind racing. But as they turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. More figures were emerging from the ship, their silver forms glinting in the early morning light. And they were heading straight for the caves. The soldier saw it too, his face hardening. "We need to warn the others." They moved as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. But even as they ran, the engineer couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The beings were fast, too fast. And they were closing in. As they reached the entrance to the caves, the engineer turned to the soldier, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. Then he turned to her, his expression grim. "We fight." But as the first of the silver beings appeared at the edge of the valley, the engineer couldn't help but wonder, how do you fight something you don't understand? The answer she knew was coming. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The silver beings moved with an eerie precision, their forms gliding across the rocky terrain as if the ground itself bent to their will. The engineer and the soldier stood at the mouth of the cave, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in unison. The settlers behind them were silent, their fear palpable, their eyes wide with a mix of terror and desperation. The soldier tightened his grip on the makeshift weapon he had fashioned from a piece of broken machinery, his knuckles white. The engineer clutched her scanner, her mind racing for a solution, for anything that could give them an edge. But deep down she knew they were outmatched. These beings were not just advanced, they were something else entirely. As the first of the silver figures approached, the soldier stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Stay back," he shouted, raising his weapon. The being paused, its head tilting slightly as if studying him. For a moment, there was silence, a fragile, trembling pause that felt like the calm before a storm. Then, without warning, the being raised its hand and a faint hum filled the air. The soldier's weapon flew from his grasp, landing several feet away with a clatter. He stumbled back, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The engineer's mind raced. They weren't just physically superior, they had technology that defied everything humanity understood. She glanced at the scanner in her hands, the readings spiking erratically. Whatever energy these beings were using, it was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't just power, it was alive, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost familiar. Before she could process the thought, the being spoke. Its voice was not a sound but a vibration, a resonance that echoed in their minds rather than their ears. The words were unintelligible, a language that twisted and turned in ways that made her head ache. But the meaning was clear. It wasn't a threat. It was a command. Surrender. The soldier shook his head, his jaw clenched. "We're not giving up," he muttered, more to himself than to the being. He glanced at the engineer, his eyes searching hers for an idea, a plan, anything. But she was just as lost as he was. Then, something unexpected happened. The scanner in her hands began to emit a low, steady beep. She looked down, her eyes widening as the screen lit up with a new signal. It was faint, but it was there, a pulse similar to the one they had detected before but different. It was coming from deep within the caves. The engineer's heart leapt. "There's something in there," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. "Another signal. It's responding to them." The soldier frowned. "What are you talking about?" She didn't have time to explain. The silver beings were advancing again, their movements slow but deliberate. She grabbed the soldier's arm, her grip tight. "We need to get deeper into the caves. Now." He hesitated, his eyes darting between her and the approaching figures. Then, with a sharp nod, he turned to the settlers. "Everyone move. Go deeper into the caves. Stay together and don't stop for anything." The group scrambled to obey, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls as they fled deeper into the darkness. The engineer led the way, her scanner guiding her like a compass. The signal grew stronger with every step, the beeps coming faster, more urgently. Whatever was down here, it was close. Behind them, the silver beings followed, their pace unhurried as if they knew there was no escape. The engineer's mind raced with questions. What was this signal? Why was it responding to the beings? And why had it only activated now? As they rounded a corner, the cave opened up into a large chamber. The air was colder here, the walls slick with moisture. In the center of the chamber was a structure, a machine ancient and covered in the same strange symbols as the ships. It was massive, its surface etched with patterns that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. And it was active. The engineer's breath caught in her throat. This is impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This technology, it's not human. But it's not theirs either." The soldier stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the machine. "What are you saying?" She shook her head, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. I'm saying this isn't theirs. It's something else. Something older. And it's reacting to them. As if on cue, the machine began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the chamber. The symbols on its surface glowed brighter, their light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The engineer's scanner went wild, the readings spiking off the charts. She could feel the energy in the air, a tangible force that made her skin prickle. The silver beings entered the chamber, their forms silhouetted against the glowing machine. They paused, their heads tilting as if listening to something only they could hear. Then one of them stepped forward, its hand reaching out toward the machine. The engineer's heart raced. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't touch it." But it was too late. The being's hand made contact with the machine, and the chamber erupted in light. The force of the energy threw everyone to the ground, the air filled with a deafening roar. The engineer shielded her eyes, her mind reeling. What had they done? When the light finally faded, the chamber was silent. The machine was still active, its symbols glowing brighter than ever. But the silver beings, they were gone. Vanished as if they had never been there. The soldier sat up slowly, his face pale. What the hell just happened? The engineer didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the machine, her mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a key. A key to something far bigger than they could imagine. And now it was awake. But as she stared at the glowing symbols, a chilling thought crept into her mind. If the machine wasn't theirs, whose was it? And what had they just unleashed? The settlers began to stir, their voices low and fearful. The soldier helped the engineer to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. "We need to figure this out," he said, his voice grim. "Before it's too late." She nodded, her heart heavy with dread. But as she looked at the machine, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already out of time. The stakes had just gotten higher. And the real battle was only beginning. The machine's hum grew louder, filling the chamber with a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The engineer stared at it, her mind racing. The silver beings were gone, but the machine was still active, its symbols pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost alive. She stepped closer, her scanner buzzing wildly in her hands. The readings were off the charts, a chaotic swirl of energy that defied explanation. Whatever this machine was, it wasn't just reacting to the silver beings, it was responding to something else. Something deeper. The soldier moved to her side, his eyes fixed on the machine. "What's it doing?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But it's not just a machine. It's like a gateway. Or a beacon. And it's calling to something." The settlers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. One of them, a young woman clutching a child to her chest, spoke up. "What do we do? Can we stop it?" The engineer hesitated. She didn't have an answer. The machine was beyond anything she had ever seen, its technology so advanced it might as well have been magic. But she couldn't just stand there and do nothing. She had to try. She stepped closer to the machine, her hand reaching out toward its surface. The symbols glowed brighter as her fingers neared, the hum growing louder, more intense. She could feel the energy radiating from it, a force that made her skin prickle and her hair stand on end. But she didn't pull back. She had to know. She had to understand. Her fingers brushed the surface and the world exploded. Light flooded her vision, blinding and overwhelming. She felt herself being pulled as if the machine had reached out and grabbed her, dragging her into its depths. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was falling, tumbling through a void filled with swirling colors and shapes, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts at once. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. She was standing in a vast, empty space, the ground beneath her feet smooth and cold. The air was still, the silence absolute. She looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. Where was she? What had happened? Before she could make sense of it, a voice spoke. It wasn't a sound, but a presence, a thought that filled her mind. "You have awakened the gateway." She spun around, but there was no one there. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We are the ones who came before," the voice replied. "The ones who built this machine. And you, little human, have stumbled into a war far greater than you can imagine." Her mind reeled. A war? With who? "With them," the voice said, and suddenly images flooded her mind. The silver beings, their ships, their technology. But there was more. Other beings, ancient and powerful, locked in a conflict that had lasted millennia. A war for control of the galaxy, for the very fabric of reality itself. She stumbled back, her legs weak. "Why are you showing me this? What do you want from us? You have awakened the gateway, the voice repeated. And now you must choose. Join us and fight for the survival of all life. Or stand aside and watch as the galaxy burns. Before she could respond, the light returned, pulling her back into the void. She felt herself falling again, the colors and shapes swirling around her. And then, with a jolt, she was back in the chamber, standing in front of the machine. The soldier grabbed her arm, his face pale. What happened? You just froze. Are you okay? She nodded, her mind still reeling. I saw something. Something incredible. And something terrifying. Before she could explain, the machine's hum changed, growing deeper, more resonant. The symbols on its surface began to shift, their patterns rearranging themselves into something new. The engineer's scanner went wild, the readings spiking higher than ever. And then the machine activated. A beam of light shot out from its surface, piercing the ceiling of the chamber and disappearing into the sky above. The ground shook violently, the air filled with a deafening roar. The settlers screamed, clutching each other as the world seemed to collapse around them. The engineer stared at the beam, her heart pounding. It's a signal, she whispered. It's calling them. The soldier's eyes widened. Calling who? Before she could answer, the sky above the chamber split open, a jagged tear of light that seemed to defy the laws of physics. From the tear emerged a ship, massive and dark, its surface etched with symbols that glowed with an eerie light. But it wasn't the silver being's ship. This was something else. Something older. Something far more powerful. The engineer's breath caught in her throat. It's them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The ones who built the machine. The ship hovered above the chamber, its presence overwhelming. The settlers stared in awe and terror, their faces pale with fear. The soldier stepped forward, his weapon raised, but the engineer grabbed his arm. Don't, she said, her voice firm. This isn't a fight we can win. He hesitated, his eyes darting between her and the ship. Then what do we do? She took a deep breath, her mind racing. The voice had given her a choice. Join them or stand aside. But was that really the only option? Was there another way? Before she could decide, the ship began to descend, its massive hull blocking out the sky. The air was thick with tension, the silence heavy and oppressive. The engineer stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what was going to happen next. But she knew one thing. This was the moment that would change everything. As the ship touched down, a door slid open and a figure stepped out. It was tall and slender, its form shimmering with a light that seemed to come from within. It looked at her, its eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and something else, something she couldn't quite place. You have awakened the gateway, it said, its voice echoing in her mind. Now you must choose. She looked at the settlers, their faces filled with fear and hope. She looked at the soldier, his jaw clenched, his eyes steady. And she looked at the machine, its symbols glowing brighter than ever. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she made her choice. But as the figure stepped closer, the engineer couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The war was far from over. And the real battle was yet to come. The figure stepped closer, its presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The engineer stood her ground, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She had made her choice and now there was no turning back. The settlers and the soldier watched in silence, their breaths held, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream to run. But there was nowhere to run. This was it. The moment that would decide their fate. The figure stopped a few feet away, its shimmering form casting an otherworldly glow over the chamber. It tilted its head, studying her with eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. You have chosen, it said, its voice resonating in her mind. But know this, the path you have chosen is not an easy one. The war you have awakened to is ancient, and its stakes are higher than you can imagine. The engineer nodded, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. We understand. But we're ready. We have to be. The figure regarded her for a moment longer, then turned its gaze to the settlers and the soldier. You are few but you are strong. And strength in times like these is what matters most. It raised its hand and a beam of light shot out from its palm, striking the machine in the center of the chamber. The symbols on its surface flared brightly, their patterns shifting and rearranging once more. The hum grew louder, more intense until it felt like the very air was vibrating. And then with a final deafening roar, the machine activated. The beam of light that had pierced the sky earlier returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a signal, it was a bridge. A connection. The engineer could feel it, a pull in her chest, a sense of something vast and ancient reaching out to them. The figure stepped back, its form beginning to fade. "The gateway is open," it said, its voice growing fainter. "The choice is yours. But remember, the war is not just theirs. It is yours as well." And then it was gone. The chamber fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the machine. The settlers and the soldiers stared at the engineer, their faces filled with questions. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. "We need to move," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't over. Not yet." The soldier nodded, his expression grim. "Where do we go?" She looked at the machine, its symbols still glowing brightly. "Through the gateway. It's our only chance." The settlers hesitated, their fear palpable. But then one by one they began to nod. They had come this far. They couldn't stop now. The engineer stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward the machine. The symbols flared as her fingers neared, the hum growing louder. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and touched the surface. The world exploded in light. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the chamber. She was standing on a vast, open plain, the sky above filled with stars so bright they seemed to burn. The air was crisp and clean, the ground beneath her feet soft and warm. The settlers and the soldier appeared beside her, their faces filled with awe. "Where are we?" one of the settlers asked, his voice trembling. The engineer shook her head. "I don't know. But this is where we need to be." As they began to explore, they realized they weren't alone. Other figures began to appear, their forms shimmering like the one they had seen in the chamber. But these weren't enemies. They were allies. Warriors from countless worlds, united in a common cause. The war the figure had spoken of was real, and it was here. The engineer felt a surge of hope. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were fighters. And they weren't alone. The soldier stepped up beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. "What now?" She smiled, a small, determined smile. "Now we fight. For our world. For our future. For everything we've ever known." And as the first light of a new dawn broke over the horizon, they knew they were ready. The war was far from over, but they had found their place in it. And together they would face whatever came next. The end.